It was a nomadic lifestyle, which must have been really quite difficult because he was that much younger than his sisters. So it was almost as if it was just a part of the baggage that went along with the moves.
When it comes to royal news, the British tabloids are easy to predict. The focus is always on King Charles, Prince William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan, filling the front pages with the same familiar names. Yet, one member of the family remains almost unknown. Prince Edward has one of the most fascinating stories of all, but his life rarely makes the headlines. As the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II, his journey has been unlike any of his siblings. So why has his name remained in the shadows? Join us as we uncover why you've never heard much about Prince Edward. A quiet royal path. Prince Edward, Anthony, Richard Louis entered the world on March 10, 1964. He was born at Buckingham Palace in London, the youngest of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip's 4 children. By the time of his birth, his siblings were already established in their own paths. Edward's arrival was met with warm excitement in the family, but from the beginning, he would stand apart, shaped by one unusual decision his mother made that morning. For the birth, Queen Elizabeth asked Prince Philip to be present. At the time, this was nothing short of shocking. Fathers were not expected to attend births in Britain, and certainly not royal fathers. In fact, no British royal consort before Philip had taken part in the delivery of his child. Traditionally, men waited elsewhere in the palace or hospital, pacing nervously, while the delivery room remained a private, all-female space of doctors and nurses. Yet Elizabeth, who was not only queen but also a young woman influenced by her time, insisted that Philip be there. This move was inspired partly by the culture of the early 1960s. Women's magazines had begun to publish articles encouraging men to play a role in childbirth. The idea was still fresh and often frowned upon, but it reflected a changing world. For Elizabeth, who had often carried the weight of tradition, allowing Philip in was her way of saying that family could bend protocol. Philip, who had long wanted to be closer to his children, welcomed the chance. That moment has been remembered as a small but symbolic turning point. It showed that even in the most traditional of families, there could be room for change. And for Edward, who came into the world under those circumstances, it almost set the stage for how his life would play out. He would never quite follow the royal mold in the way his siblings did. His story was not about grabbing the spotlight or becoming the subject of endless headlines. Instead, it was about carving a quieter path, one that often went unseen but still carried weight. Of course, his siblings cast a large shadow. Charles was heir to the throne, and his every move was watched by press and public alike. Anne grew quickly into a strong-willed young woman known for her sharp character and love of horses. Andrew, though much younger than Charles and Anne, carried his own share of attention as the cheeky one of the family. Against all that, Edward slipped quietly into his place. Less noticed, less discussed. Even in birth announcements and press coverage, his arrival was marked without the same fanfare as Charles's birth in 1948 or Andrew's in 1960. It was not neglect, but simply reality. The nation had already seen 3 royal children. Another prince was pleasant news, but not a shock. Looking back, historians often note how that very beginning captured the tone of his life. A royal, yes, but not one who defined headlines. A man shaped by unusual moments, but often living outside the spotlight. For many people today, his name is still less familiar than those of his siblings. Yet his birth, marked by his father's groundbreaking presence, gave the first clue that Edward's story would not be like the others. That introduction into royal life is why, even now, when people think of the Queen's children, Edward is often the one who slips from memory. But as his journey unfolds, it becomes clear that his quieter role was never without meaning. When Charles and Anne were growing up in the 1950s, the monarchy was still marked by formality and distance. The Queen was carrying the full weight of her new role and her time with her first two children was limited. By the time Edward came along, things had shifted. The royal family was learning to balance tradition with modern life, and Edward, as the youngest, benefited from that change. He had more direct access to his parents than Charles and Anne did at the same age. Prince Philip, who had been away for long periods while serving in the Navy during Charles' early years, was more present in Edward's upbringing. He encouraged outdoor play, hands-on learning, and open curiosity. Edward's childhood, though privileged, often felt more ordinary than the strict routines that had shaped his older brother and sister. This closeness with Philip gave Edward a grounding that many observers later described as steady. He was never the loudest of the four siblings, nor the one to attract scandal or constant press. Instead, he grew up watching, listening, and taking cues from those around him. In family gatherings, his quieter temperament often stood out. Andrew, just 4 years older, was boisterous and full of energy, always drawing attention with his playfulness. Anne, already a teenager when Edward was a boy, had a tough and resilient streak. She pushed against expectations in her own way, especially through sport and her commitment to riding. Against those strong personalities, Edward naturally fell into a different role, the thoughtful, observant younger brother. Still, his childhood was not without big moments. In 1969, when he was just 5, Edward was introduced to Neil Armstrong shortly after the astronaut's famous first steps on the moon. Meeting the man who had achieved something no human had ever done before left a lasting impression. For Edward, it sparked a lifelong respect for extraordinary human achievement. He would never pursue science or space himself, but that sense of wonder at people who broke boundaries stayed with him. It became part of his outlook, admiration for achievement without needing to be the one in the spotlight. Edward also experienced a more open, modern royal childhood because of the changing role of the monarchy itself. The 1960s and 70s saw the royals being presented in a less formal way, especially with the famous 1969 documentary Royal Family, which gave the public a glimpse of the Windsors in their private lives. Edward, though still a child, was part of this new openness. He appeared on screen alongside his parents and siblings, showing the world a less distant image of monarchy. Even then, though, he remained in the background. That pattern would follow him through life. Rather than competing for attention, Edward grew into himself at his own pace, content not to dominate the stage. This mix of a modern upbringing, a strong bond with his father, and exposure to extraordinary figures like Neil Armstrong created the foundation for his later choices. And soon, those choices would take shape during his school years, beginning with his time at Gordonstown and beyond. Finding his own stage. When it came time for school, Edward was sent to Gordonstown in Scotland. This was the same boarding school that Prince Philip had loved in his youth, but the same one Charles had hated. Charles once described it as coldeets in kilts, comparing it to a prison. For Edward, though, the experience was different. He did not carry the same pressure as his elder brother, and perhaps because of that, Gordonstown suited him. Edward thrived in the school's tough but balanced environment. The days were long and demanding, but Edward found his place. He worked hard and earned respect from both peers and teachers. In time, he became head boy, the top student leadership role. It was a responsibility that spoke to his reliability and authority. Unlike Charles, who often felt out of step in the school, Edward managed to fit in and build confidence. One of the key discoveries Edward made during his years there was his love for theater. Drama was a strong part of Gordonstown life, and Edward not only took part in plays, but also grew passionate about the stage. He was drawn to the way stories could be told, how characters came alive, and how audiences responded. That interest would later push him into ventures that surprised many who expected a more traditional royal career. The theater gave Edward an outlet that was different from the traditional paths his siblings took. Anne's passion was horses and sport. Charles found his identity in environmental causes and art. Andrew, for his part, gravitated toward the military. For Edward, it was drama. Plays and productions offered him a way to step outside himself and connect with people in new ways. It was creative, expressive, and unlike anything the monarchy usually encouraged. After Gordonstown, Edward enrolled at Jesus College, Cambridge, where he studied history. University life gave Edward a chance to live outside the rigid structures of palace and boarding school. He joined student theater productions and stayed connected to his interest in drama, while also pursuing his studies seriously. At Cambridge, Edward showed once again that he was different from the image people expected of a prince. He didn't act entitled, nor did he seek special treatment. Instead, he blended into student life in a way that caught attention for being normal rather than privileged. Friends described him as approachable, modest, and more focused on his interests than his royal status. It was also during these years that his sense of independence deepened. Being away from the royal bubble gave him a taste of ordinary life, even if it was never truly ordinary. It was preparation for the choices he would make later, many of them surprising to the public. Now, when most people imagine the early career of a prince, they picture military training, ceremonial duties, or life spent in the orbit of Buckingham Palace. Edward chose something very different. After graduating from Cambridge, he decided to travel halfway around the world to New Zealand. For 6 months, he worked at Wanganui Collegiate School, a respected private school that gave him his first taste of life far from royal protocol. Edward served there as a junior master and as a theater assistant. He was involved in staging productions, guiding students in performance, and helping to run drama workshops. It was work that allowed him to stay connected to the passion for theater he had developed at Gordonstown and Cambridge, but this time in a practical, teaching role. Instead of being the prince in front of cameras, he was Mr. Windsor to his students, directing plays and encouraging creativity. This was not the glamorous side of royal life. Edward lived simply, sharing quarters like any other young teacher and taking on the ordinary responsibilities of the job. He had to plan lessons, manage lively teenagers, and balance the daily routine of school life. His students remembered him not as a royal figure, but as someone approachable, with a natural interest in helping others learn. In that environment, his title mattered far less than his commitment to the work. What stood out most about his time in New Zealand was how far it was from the stiff expectations placed on him back home. He could walk the streets of Wanganui with a level of freedom he rarely had in Britain. That freedom gave him a glimpse of what life outside the royal bubble looked like. It was a small but important break from tradition, and it deepened his sense of independence. The experience also broadened his perspective. Living in another country, far removed from the formality of London and Windsor, allowed him to see how ordinary people worked, studied, and lived without the constant attention of the press. New Zealanders knew who he was, of course, but they treated him with a matter-of-fact approach that stripped away much of the royal aura. That attitude helped Edward feel grounded in a way that palace life often struggled to provide. For a young man whose childhood had been defined by royal walls and endless protocol, the chance to live and work in another part of the world was eye-opening. It gave him a sense of the global community beyond Britain, and it also showed him that he could step into roles that did not rely on his title. Many later observers have said this 6-month period explained why Edward was more willing than his brothers to experiment with non-traditional careers. He had already seen that life could be built outside the mold. By the time he returned to Britain, Edward was carrying more than just memories of teaching and theater work. He had a clearer picture of who he was becoming. He was a prince, yes, but he was also a man who wanted to define his own path, even if that meant risking criticism. That desire would soon lead him into another test, this time the military. Beyond the crown. For a royal son, especially in the 1980s, the military was one path that seemed almost impossible to avoid. Prince Edward followed this tradition when he joined the Royal Marines, a branch admired for its toughness and elite reputation. The choice was not surprising. His father, Prince Philip, had built much of his life around naval service. His brother, Prince Andrew, was celebrated as a daring pilot, and Charles, though less naturally suited, had also completed naval duty. To many, Edward's entry into the Marines looked like the right next step, but Edward was never cut from the same cloth as his brothers. Training with the Marines was grueling. The discipline, the physical demands, the sheer relentlessness of it all stood in stark contrast to Edward's own temperament and interests. He was creative, sensitive, and more at home in a theater rehearsal room than a parade ground. By 1987, just months into the course, he made a decision that stunned both the public and the palace. He quit. He had completed only about a third of the training before walking away. For the British media, it was a gift. Headlines at the time were merciless. Newspapers described his exit as an embarrassment and even a humiliation for the monarchy. Here was a young prince abandoning duty, something almost unthinkable in a family built on the idea of service. The story spread quickly, feeding the narrative that Edward was the different one among his siblings. Not a soldier, not a bold adventurer, but something else entirely. Inside the family, the disappointment was sharper still. Prince Philip, a man who had survived the chaos of war and risen to command a naval ship, was reportedly furious. To him, military service was not just a career, it was a test of character. Watching his youngest son abandon it so quickly cut deeply. Even for Edward himself, it was not an easy moment. He admitted later that the Marines had simply been the wrong fit, a path he had followed out of expectation rather than passion. Yet, as painful as it was at the time, Edward's decision became a turning point. Walking away from the Marines freed him to look seriously at what did inspire him. While it may have looked like failure to many in 1987, in hindsight, it was the moment that pushed Edward firmly off the military track and toward the creative career he had long been drawn to. And that shift leads directly to his bold move into television and theater. When Prince Edward left the Marines, his first major step was joining Andrew Lloyd Webber's Really Useful Theatre Company, one of the most powerful names in British stage production. There, Edward worked behind the scenes as a production assistant. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him hands-on experience with sets, rehearsals, and the hectic life of professional theater. For once, he seemed to be somewhere that matched his creative energy. But his first big leap into television came in 1987, and it remains one of the most infamous chapters of his life. That year, Edward produced a charity game show called It's a Royal Knockout. The idea was to gather members of the royal family, including Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and even the Duchess of York, and have them compete in oversized costumes and silly games. Edward believed it would show a lighter, fun side of the monarchy and raise money for charity. Instead, it was a disaster. Critics called it bizarre, undignified, and embarrassing. The sight of royals in costumes running around on TV was something the public wasn't ready for. The press mocked Edward endlessly, and the project cemented his reputation as the odd one out of the family. Still, Edward didn't give up. In 1993, he founded his own production company, Ardent Productions. Determined to succeed on his own merits, he used the name Edward Windsor professionally, hoping to avoid accusations that he was leaning on royal privilege. The company focused on documentaries and cultural programming, and Edward threw himself into the work with determination. Among the most notable projects was Edward on Edward, a documentary about his great-uncle King Edward VIII, who had given up the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. It was a bold choice, a young royal making a film about one of the most controversial figures in family history. The project earned some respect and showed that Edward had an eye for interesting subjects. But the struggles were never far away. Ardent Productions faced constant criticism. Some in the media accused Edward of trading on his royal status despite his efforts to avoid it. Others pointed to the company's shaky finances. Big successes were rare, and many projects failed to break through. By the late 1990s, reports revealed that the company was losing money and struggling to survive. What stood out, though, was Edward's persistence. For nearly 9 years, he fought to keep Ardent alive, even as the press ridiculed him. It was a period that showed both his resilience and his flaws. Eventually, the losses forced him to step back, and Ardent Productions ceased operations in the early 2000s. And while the venture didn't turn him into the television mogul he once hoped to be, it marked Edward as a royal willing to take risks. That willingness to break the mold would follow him into the next stage of his life: love, marriage, and a partnership that finally gave him stability. A steady partnership. Edward's personal life began to steady in the early 1990s when he met Sophie Rhys-Jones. Their first encounter was at a charity tennis match, the kind of event where royals often made appearances. But this meeting carried weight. Sophie was not from the aristocracy. She worked in public relations, knew how to handle pressure, and had a grounded way about her. Edward, who had often seemed restless in his choices, found in her someone who was calm, practical, and supportive. When they married in 1999, it was at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The ceremony carried all the grace of a royal wedding, but without the grandeur of Charles and Diana's spectacular event in 1981. There were fewer crowds, less media frenzy, and a tone that reflected Edward and Sophie's personalities. They wanted something elegant but modest, something that focused on their bond rather than on spectacle. The marriage proved to be one of the most enduring and scandal-free in modern royal history. While many royal unions buckled under public scrutiny, Edward and Sophie quietly thrived. They leaned on one another, supported the Queen with dignity, and largely avoided missteps that often caught others. Sophie, in particular, became deeply admired by Queen Elizabeth II, who saw in her a woman of loyalty and reliability. Over the years, Sophie grew into one of the monarchy's most trusted working members, often stepping in where others faltered. The couple also built a strong family life. They had 2 children, Lady Louise, born in 2003, and James, born in 2007, who became Earl of Wessex after Edward. Unlike previous generations, Edward and Sophie made a deliberate choice for their children. They declined to style them as prince and princess, allowing Louise and James to grow up with more privacy and freedom than most royal children. It was a conscious decision to shield them from the pressures that had weighed so heavily on Edward himself when he was young. Lady Louise, who has grown into a thoughtful young woman with a passion for carriage driving, inherited her grandfather Prince Philip's love of the sport. James, meanwhile, has maintained an even lower profile, living most of his life away from cameras. If Edward's early career looked uncertain, his marriage provided him with the steadiness he had lacked. With Sophie at his side, he finally found both companionship and purpose. Together, they set an example of how the royal family could adapt to modern expectations while holding on to tradition. And it was that sense of steady reliability that carried Edward into a new chapter of service, as he and Sophie began to take on more official roles within the monarchy. When Edward married Sophie, the Queen gave him the title Earl of Wessex. It was unusual. No royal had carried it before, and it surprised many who expected a more traditional dukedom. The choice came after Edward reportedly asked for it, inspired by a character in the film Shakespeare in Love. The title itself hinted at his difference, a man willing to carve out a slightly unconventional path within the rigid structures of monarchy. For the first few years of marriage, Edward and Sophie tried to juggle careers with royal responsibilities. He ran Ardent Productions, and she managed her public relations firm. But the pressure of balancing business with duty became clear. In 2002, after several controversies involving the companies, they both stepped away from their professional work. From then on, Edward and Sophie became full-time working royals, devoting themselves to service on behalf of the crown. One of Edward's most important roles was taking over his father's lifelong project, the Duke of Edinburgh's Award. Founded by Prince Philip in 1956, the program challenged young people worldwide to push themselves through volunteering, physical activity, and skills development. Edward threw himself into the role with energy, traveling across the globe to meet participants. It was a natural fit. Unlike military command or frontline politics, this was a space where his quiet, steady personality shone. He wasn't looking for headlines. He was encouraging achievement, one young person at a time. His royal service also came with a range of honorary military positions. Over the years, he became Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Wessex Yeomanry, Colonel of the London Guards, Honorary Air Commodore of RAF Waddington, and Commodore-in-Chief of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. These were not combat roles, but symbolic connections between the armed forces and the crown. Edward carried them with seriousness, often visiting bases and taking part in ceremonial duties. On the international stage, Edward has represented the United Kingdom at key events. His steady presence has been valuable, particularly in moments when Charles or William were stretched thin by commitments or health concerns. Most recently, in 2025, Edward attended the inauguration of Pope Leo XIV, a reminder that he is often the royal called upon for significant but less spotlight-heavy occasions. The evolution of his titles also marks his journey. In 2023, King Charles formally granted Edward the title Duke of Edinburgh, fulfilling the wish of Prince Philip, who had long hoped his youngest son would inherit it. For Edward, it was more than an honor. It was a recognition that he had stepped fully into the role his father once held, carrying forward a legacy of dedication and service. That recognition deepened further on his 60th birthday in 2024 when Edward was appointed to the Order of the Thistle, Scotland's highest order of chivalry. It was a rare distinction, reserved for those who had shown extraordinary service to the nation. Today, Edward is not the most visible member of the family, but he is one of the most reliable. When King Charles's health or Prince William's packed schedule makes gaps appear, Edward is often the one who fills them. He has become the steady hand, the dependable figure who doesn't attract drama, but ensures the work gets done. And as the monarchy faces new pressures in the modern age, his role has only grown more important, showing that sometimes the quietest royals leave the strongest impression. Has Prince Edward's path made him more respected in the long run, or has it kept him unfairly overlooked compared to the rest of the royal family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.